Now, let's assume that you have followed my advice. You've gone through something like ShotDeck or any other way to get exposure to the maximum number of styles and different approaches, different types of coverage, different types of lighting, and you've started to develop this pattern recognition, things that you do and don't like. And let's also say you've also done a little bit of work on the light meter essentials. You've looked at what you do and don't like there, and now you're starting to guess, you're starting to sort of approximate what those levels might be before you hit false color. Right? So this is becoming second nature. The way that you're seeing these images and you're seeing or you're interpreting what must have been the real world lighting scenarios to lead then to the final image. And because we are trying to build up that muscle of being a translator between the real world and the camera. We need to see as though the camera sees, not as we see. Because ideally, if we could see exactly as the camera sees, then we don't need the camera for anything. We can just predict accurately in our mind what that's going to be by looking at the scene. That's like master level cinematographer. And I am certainly not there yet, but I'm working every day to try and get there. I'm working every day to try and close that gap between what I see with my actual eyes and what the camera is going to see. So, and the more that you can predict that, the better it's going to be, because you can inform everyone on the team around you exactly what you need in order to get the look that you want, or to get the look that yourself and the director and everyone else involved is looking for. Those are things that make you an effective cinematographer. You've done that. You've gone through, you've done the pattern recognition. Now, I would say the benefit is in identifying specific scenes where you can start to recognize how these patterns change and how the exposure is then changing throughout a scene. So now we're looking for specific scenes. And if we jump in to Resolve, I'll give you an example. I'm in a series here. We're looking at, just watching it through Resolve, and I'm going to identify a specific scene, and we're going to say, okay, why were some of these choices made, and what is the actual exposure involved in this choice? So let's just watch it through without the false color on. Make it bigger here. Okay, so we've got this lady, she's pouring some coffee. It's going to be in a cafeteria. Already, if I was going to guess mood, we can already start to guess, if we see in our Matrix Neo view, like what are some of the elements here, right? This is probably down -4, -3 in the background everywhere. -2 back here. These highlights maybe are +1, probably at key. They're very dim practicals, right? Maybe here you get a little pop, so maybe that's +1, but there's nothing here except maybe here that's above key. So very low on the box scale. Again, we cannot infer anything about the actual light levels on set looking at a still like this. All we can look at is the distribution. The box is up to us as the cinematographers to constrain physical reality. Here we're only looking at the distribution. So, okay, that looks like my distribution. It's quite down on the overall levels, like again, nothing being a key. And then we come into we're just going to look at a simple coverage of two individuals talking. Immediately, what do you see here? Like, I'll go back just to call this out because we talked about it earlier in the course. As we come to this, which is probably the widest shot in the entire scene, there is light to dark, but we're not crafting any light to dark in the foreground. Okay, so the wider that we come back, the less number of variables in order to draw people into exactly where to look. This is a pattern that you find again and again and again. And it's something that we're going to want to remember because it's useful. If you try and fit too many things, if you try and put too much shape in the wide, it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of manpower. It's going to take a lot of equipment. None of those things are generally good, and you're probably going to be worse off for it. If it was better, chances are that you would see it more often, right? Especially in the images that you're drawn to. So much less shape on the faces than there. That also has to deal with the technicalities of actually getting the equipment in there to do this. But now, let's look at the levels here. What are we imagining these levels are? Right? What do we immediately see? We're guessing now before we turn on false color. The entire time we're reading. Do we see anything anywhere near at key? I would say no. Maybe down here. Maybe this is at key. This hand here. But everything seems really low. This looks like maybe 4 stops under, maybe 3 in here. So let's say 3 stops under. I'm going to say this is at key, or this is even, like key minus half a stop. And there's a little bit of this backlight here, and I'd say that's at -2. So we've got -2, then we've got -3, -4 for the shadow side, and then we've got key at -1/2. And then back here we've got little dots of, even still, I don't think these are, maybe those are at key, reading on the spot meter, but I doubt it. Very, very low. And here, again, -5, -4 in this foreground. We're not caring anything about that. And then all we're going to do is we're going to switch on false color, and what do we see? Okay, so this is under. Maybe that's, like I said down here, this is probably the brightest part of the image, and that's going to be a stop under. So that's a stop under. So then here is even lower. Let's make that pen a little bit bigger. Here is even lower than that. So this is on that box scale, we're way down in the dark. Like we're setting these levels incredibly darkened down. Let's come off of this. And we keep reviewing. What's going to be it like for the coverage the other way? This is the next question. Okay, here. Okay, this is immediately brighter. We've got a lot more travel to the other side of the face as well. Okay, why is this? Is this our main character? Is this because it's a lady, we want to make it look nicer than the guy? These are questions that always come up. It also feels like there's a lot more fill over here. Not near as pronounced on the backlight, but same pattern in the background, no change there. And if we turn on false color, okay, definitely is more level here, right? As to our suspicion, we've also got that little Rembrandt triangle over here, but really this is down, this could be down to just skin tones as opposed to lighting any differently. But look at the background, how, again, the benefit of false color is we're just not used to looking at images this way. So it's so foreign that it immediately draws you. It's almost like really good cinematography, right? It's telling you, it's removing all of the elements that distract you and telling you exactly where you should be looking. You should be looking wherever there's contrast, right? This is where you should be looking. This is where you should be looking. Why are these things there? And why is that pattern the way that it is? And what does it do to the viewer to see the image like that? So I would be going through and I would be finding every scene that I could possibly think of. And you think, okay, much like exposure, there's going to be 1,000 different scenes that we're going to have to go through. Well, it turns out there's not actually that many scenes either. And that's for a completely different course. But you go through enough of these scenes and you start to build these patterns and recognize, okay, I see what they did here in the wide. They limited the number of contrast areas to draw the eye. Then here, we prettied up in the same fashion almost every single time. And what changes here is, you could imagine how much different the mood is. Let's pause it there. Okay, so now, as we've gone in closer, let's see what happens to the exposure. Okay, we've still got that there. Everything else is the exact same. The same pattern in the background. We're in the same spot. The framing, you can almost tell the framing from the false color as well. Like, why would we frame it in this way? What is beneficial about this frame, seeing the patterns in the background? But here it's, let's take this false color off. You're going through these things and you're thinking, okay, now, what would this look like if the background was 2 stops brighter? Like, how does this affect, because this light, it feels like it fits in the space very well, right? And that's something that we're always fighting even as skilled cinematographers. It's like you don't want something to feel lit. And if you don't want something to feel lit, the key light and all of the movie magic that you do in the foreground, it has to blend in, it has to sit in a zone that is not too dissimilar from the background. But obviously there's a lot more gear, there's a lot more lighting happening here locally in these singles and over-the-shoulder shots than there are in the wider shots. So you have to make this sit in there. So ask yourself, if this exact same ratio, so let's talk key and fill and backlight at this stage, right? This is a beautiful, again, let's say half under, -3, -4 in the shadows, and then -2 on the backlight. Okay, that's just imagine that we've photoshopped him out of that background. And now let's imagine we take this exact same lighting setup and we put it in a world where instead of the background being 3 to -4 under with little pops of highlights, let's say we place it in a at key environment, right? Just at key, at 0. This starts to look very fake, right? The ratios just don't compute and they don't mix. And this is something that you can tell very, very quickly from that light meter test, right? From that light meter footage. So again, it seems like it's repetition, and that's exactly what it is. It's repetitive. And it worked for me because I had these doubts that it cannot be as simple as it appears. It cannot be that there's only really about 10 exposures that I enjoy. If that's the case, that makes the job significantly easier. And then you think to yourself, well, if it's this easy to just get this exposure, well then cinematography as a job must be pretty mundane. It must be pretty repetitive. It must be not that challenging. What you quickly realize once you get on set is this is just the start, right? This is just because you know these things doesn't mean you can actually pull it off on the day. You have to arrange all of the talent. You have to arrange all of the crew, all of the equipment to be able to facilitate this knowledge, which is why you cannot be thinking about this on set, right? You can't be computing this stuff on set and be deciding. You have to already have this thing so ingrained that you're focused on all of the other moving elements. So that is why it appears as though we're doing the same thing over and over and over again. Because in fact, you are doing the same thing over and over and over again. So I would be very intentional at this stage, after we find pattern recognition, start to find and watch complete scenes, right? Start to finish, find scenes that work with coverage that works, get it into the Bodvo system of, okay, these are the ways that I tackle this type of blocking. These are the ways that I tackle this type of sequence. And once you do that, you're going to find your skills increase at an incredibly rapid pace. So now let's say that you have put in the hours and hours and hours that are necessary to build up this conviction in your mind that not only can you recognize the patterns, you understand the levels and how they relate to one another, you understand the ratios, you know about the boxes and the distributions that happen inside of those boxes to be the most effective cinematographer that you can be. And once you get to that level, the only thing that is really left that provides value is the binge watching aspect of using false color. And I still to this day will throw things inside of Resolve and I will watch them in false color just to see the things that I might be missing. Because even though I would think that my skills on understanding the exposures inside of these distribution ranges is elevated as opposed to the common person, I still like to be assured that that is the case. And that's what false color can do for you. So I will go and binge watch things entirely. I'll watch them through. I'll watch a scene through. I'll go back. I'll watch it in false color just to make sure that this muscle is still there, especially if I've been away from set for an extended period of time. If I go through slower periods of work where you're not able to exercise this muscle, if you're doing a feature film or if you're on a longer commercial where you're working on set every day for weeks on end, you get really, really good at not only being to recognize these patterns, but put them into place and be able to set the mood exactly where you want it. If you get out of that practice, you can just watch entire shows inside of Resolve using false color or flooding out to your external monitor that has false color. And all of the work that you do there is never wasted. Right? Those things I think are only beneficial, even if you have done it 1,000 times. I think anytime you're looking at false color and analyzing images through there, I don't think it's wasted energy. So this, even at the, let's say the mastery level, I think you'll be finding yourself coming back to this pattern of looking at images to reinforce the things that you already know and areas that you want to explore, because there'll always be new work or new projects that inspire you. And if that's the case with me, when I see them, I want to understand exactly how they were made. What has changed from the patterns that I thought I was able to recognize before? Is there anything different that is happening here? Is the distribution, has it changed? Has it altered? Is there any patterns that I can start to recognize? So I'm constantly coming back and I'll just binge watch things. So there's Starting out, get that pattern recognition, just exposure to as many different elements as you can. Then going scene by scene, specifically of programs or films or series that you actually intentionally like and enjoy, or maybe that you dislike as well, to understand what could go wrong. And then, of course, you have to look at your own work as well during this process to see how close am I getting? What are the reasons that I'm not getting as close as some of these other things? Because, again, the beautiful part about exposure is you cannot fake false color. It's not like the cinematographer in exposure terms is doing nothing that you cannot decipher from the final image using false color this way. And if that's the case, and if you match those levels and you're not getting the same results, that's not possible. Yeah, somewhere else there is a problem. And that's why cinematography in general is really fun, because it's very objective. It's like, at the end of the day, did you get the results or not? If you didn't get the results in exposure, we can fix that problem. That should be a really easy fix. You should be able to immediately identify, throw on false color and go, that's where I made a mistake. I went too heavy on the fill. I went too little on the contrast. I didn't have any variance in the background. This is what false color is good for. And this just constant exposure to different images and your own images and reviewing them is what has allowed myself to skip a huge chunk of being not very good at marrying up the images in my head with what I could create with the camera, with the lighting, with the crew, with the scenes on an actual set. So now that all the building blocks are in place and we've done all the hard work of doing everything offset that we could possibly do, in the next section, we are going to look at how we can take the information that we have gained here, the knowledge that we have acquired, and how that can be implemented on set. So how can we take some of these skills, the ability to identify the ratios that we enjoy and find our way at the end of whatever flow chart we might want to go down as to this is going to be the style. How do you actually put that in place to, number one, to set the box, then number two, to make sure that the distribution ends up exactly where it should be? Because I think over time I've developed a few different tricks to be able to make that transition from sitting in your room doing all of this by yourself inside of Resolve, or doing all of this in front of the camera with the light meter, to then translating it to a full crew and a time crunch, and just little ideas and tips and tricks to be able to help you facilitate spreading and dispersing this knowledge to the people that need to know, so that the results end up in the final image. So let's jump into the next section, which is going to be all about the implementation of this new knowledge that you've acquired. So now we're going to take some of the ideas and some of the techniques and some of the skills that we have developed through the false color, through mastering using the light meter to be able to judge exposure, to then carry this information on set to hopefully be getting better exposure. And what does better exposure mean? When I say that, what do I think of when I say that? I just mean whatever is closest to the image that you have in your head, because that is the constant measuring stick that I am up against. That is what I determine whether or not my exposure my exposure skills are decent in the first place. It's like, can I have a representation of a scene or of an image in my head and then accurately portray that using all the techniques that we've talked about? If I can find a way to do that more consistently, then I am getting better at exposure. That is the ultimate goal in my mind. Now, it's funny when I say that, because probably I spent the most amount of time having trouble with exposure not because I didn't understand the light meter aspect of things, not because I didn't understand the false color aspect of things, but because I was neglecting coming up with a look in the first place, right? And again, it seems crazy to say that out loud now, but I was so caught up in the moment of trying to get better at cinematography and trying to get images that looked and felt like other people's, that I would constantly want to be on set trying to do those things and trying to experiment in locations that weren't the same, with tools that were not the same, with techniques that were, or with scenarios, with costume, with wardrobe that were not the same to whatever I was recreating. So there was a separation between what was possible, given the tools that I had access to, and what I was trying to replicate. So I would say the biggest thing, which sounds obvious at first to do in order to accelerate this journey, because it is it's a circular economy of getting better at exposure. You have to do all the work that we've already talked about. You have to do the light meter stuff. You have to do the false color work. But then you also have to get out there and you have to experiment and you have to try to see whether these techniques will fit into your workflow on set. But then it doesn't do you any good unless you then go back and say, okay, what did and what didn't work, right? Because that will inform then how you, if you're going to do another session, or if you're going to look at the results of the light meter day and all of those ratios that happen, all of the distribution values that might possibly pop up in a given scene, if you don't do the work to decide whether or not those are feasible on the day with the actual set that you have, with the crew numbers that you have, with the equipment that you have, then it's not going to do you any good. And one informs the other. And it's this three-prong attack of actually shooting on set, the light meter information and the light meter testing and the results, and then false color and the analysis of false color in your own work, in other people's work, to then get back onto set and try the whole thing again. The key aspect of this, and this is where I would rely on, or it's certainly easier these days to rely on things like ShotDeck, because you can just input a tiny bit of information, even a hint of a mood, of a genre, of a style, of a feeling, of a lens size, of a lens type, of a sensor size, of a sensor type. You can input tiny little details and you will just get back a huge array of different options and different styles that you can go down. So that is where I would start. You have to identify what it is that you're looking for. You have to identify what it is you want to be up against. And that is where I spent the least amount of time, because I was so interested in trying to get out there and replicate the results as fast as I could. I skipped the most important part. Right? I wanted to get out there and try the technique. I wanted to try the numbers, the math behind it, to see whether or not this was actually true. Because at the time, it hadn't been explained to me by anyone else. I was sort of stumbling on this information on my own, that it's not possible. There's no way that all of these scenes could replicate the same ratios over and over and over again inside the box of distribution of light ratios inside of a scene. There's no way that could be true. So I wanted to go out there and test it again and again and again without actually deciding, okay, it's one thing if I get those values in the right spot. It's another to see, is that matching up with the vision that I actually want for this scene? Right? Because I don't have access to those locations. I don't have access to that equipment or the talent or the production design or the art department. I don't have access to any of that. So we're not looking for a cookie cutter replica of whatever images we come up with for references. In my mind, what we're doing with those references is we're building something that we are shooting towards. It's like, can we hit the elements that we are drawn to inside of these references rather than an exact replica of those references? And that's why something like the framework is so powerful. It's like, you don't have to get all of those elements, but we want to get as close as we can to the feeling that those things give. So it's about, number one, the very first thing you have to do to be able to take any of these skills on set and have them be useful at all is being very specific about the look and the feel that you are going for. And the way that you do that is by going onto ShotDeck or by watching films and gathering images on your own. Then you go into false color and you analyze what is the distribution of those things and what aspect of the distribution inside of a frame. Maybe it's the relationship between the key and the fill. Maybe it's the relationship between the key and the backlight. Maybe it's a relationship between the backlight and the background. Like, you have to identify which part am I drawn to? And then we take that and we say, okay, that is what we're going for on this project. That is what we are going to lean into. And the more that you do that, the more you can just tick off the boxes of possible scenarios or setups that you're going to find yourself in, right? For the most part, I like to focus on, the classic, like the light meter test, the head and shoulder shot, because you can build everything out from there. But there will be countless times where you will shoot an entire scene, a setup, whatever it might be, a series of images that don't look like that at all. That don't have that framing, that don't have that distance, that don't have that distribution of key, fill, backlight, background. Like, those things don't have to be there. They're just there as a guide. There'll be times when you just do a giant silhouette wide shot and you only have the background and the backlight to play off of one another. So the on-set experience is about ticking those things off. And my advice going forward is to take as many notes as you possibly can, because you'll forget. Right? You think to yourself now, well, I'm a cinematographer, I'm working a couple times a month, I can keep track of all these scenarios in my head, especially early on in your career when the work isn't coming thick and fast. So you have a little bit more time to sit on things and to process information. I can say from experience that as the work picks up and as the speed increases, you're going to find yourself in vastly different positions and scenarios and setups. And eventually, at the end of a working year, they just all blend into one. Right? And you will become comfortable with dealing with the stress and the other things that come with being put under an enormous amount of pressure in a number of different environments. That's true. But that doesn't mean you actually get better in terms of the results that you're able to pull from those situations. And I have found that I get my best results over time is when I am my most diligent at taking notes and doing the pre-production work to say, this is what we want to lean into. If I have this vision, the more clear I can be on the vision in my head before we get there, the better my exposure results are going to be. So biggest thing before we even talk about how to implement this stuff on set is make it a habit to go out of your way. Even if you're going to do a test, even if you're going to do just a single setup just to get better at lighting and to practice with exposure, is have something that you are measuring yourself against that is crystal clear in your mind, because the clearer you can make it, the better the results are going to be in the physical world, because you will have this guidepost to help you along the path making those decisions. And then you'll be able to say to yourself, well, is this actually beneficial to me to be this locked in to this reference image? Is it in any way harming my ability to judge on set on the day what I like versus what I don't like? Because sometimes I have certainly been guilty of it, of becoming too much a victim of the numbers, of saying, this is what I want to do, right? Because you see things working over and over and over again. You start to progress a little bit, you get a little bit better, and you start seeing results that you're happy with. Well, then you think, I just need to lean more and more and more into this specific avenue, when in fact, it can actually be detrimental. So you're constantly A/B. Is this working? Is it not working? Are these ratios working? Are they not working? But to do that, you have to have a measurement that you are going to put yourself up against in the most objective way possible. Because just like when analyzing other people's work, just like when looking at false color in Resolve, where you cannot lie with the distribution of exposure in an image. You can't lie. That is the beneficial part of cinematography, is there's no funny business that's going on. There's nothing after the fact that all of a sudden the image just magically exposes itself properly and makes things look nice. You have to be that ruthless on your own work. It's like, objectively, did you get it or didn't you? If you didn't get it, where did you go wrong? Was it in the setup? Was it in the system? Or was it somewhere else? Was it somewhere outside of your control? Was it something where you wanted to be very close to those numbers, but some physical obstacle or some impediment on set on the day made it not possible, so you tried to sandwich things together and it just didn't flow? This is how, if you're as objective as possible, and you can view these images from a distance and remove yourself from all of the problems that will come on every single set, and they will come. Every cinematographer that I have ever spoken to, myself included, we will make excuses. There will be problems on every shot, on every setup, on every job. It doesn't matter what the budget is. You're always going to be up against it. So just take that as a given. Now it becomes, what did you actually come away with? Because that is the result that you will be judged on. So that being said, do your homework, find the inspiration, find the measuring stick that you want to work with. And then now let's talk about the implementation of what do we do first to help guide us down this path of setting up the box for exposure, and then allocating the distribution inside of that box. The point of control might be the single most important thing that we talk about in this entire course. If you understand what the point of control refers to, what it means, how you can use it to your advantage, then you are going to be in a better spot than if you had never heard of the concept. Again, I didn't have a film school to go to. I didn't have another cinematographer friend to explain this to me. I just stumbled upon it myself, looking at all of these images and realizing, well, what is the easiest way, if you think about it, when you're going through this false color study, what's the easiest way or the fastest way that you can get images into the distribution ratio that we talk about? How do we get, what's the path with the least amount of friction? How do we get to that distribution phase? Because if you do the homework in false color, you're going to get really good and really accurate about knowing where you'd like the distributed values inside of the box. So the problem then becomes, well, how do I then set the box? What is the most efficient way to set the box? And if you get this wrong, you can cause yourself a lot of headaches for no reason. Even to this day, if I misidentify the point of control, it can make things significantly more expensive, significantly longer to set up, many more delays, much more rigging. There's all sorts of problems that you can get if you misidentify or don't identify at all the point of control. I don't know how I could do my job if I wasn't constantly in every single setup trying to identify the point of control. So what do I mean when I say the point of control? Well, this is the area inside of a location that you are shooting in that you have the least amount of control over, or that is going to require the most amount of work to control. So there are generally, in my mind, I think of two different scenarios. You're either inside of a studio where the point of control becomes the largest light source. And generally, there's two different options for largest light source. It's either going to be your key light, depending on the size of the shot. More often than not, it's going to be the key light, or else the background area, right? The background ambient lighting. Also, sometimes we talk about this in room tone. Those two things, those two elements, if you're in a studio location, are going to be the hardest to control, or the one that is the largest. So the largest setup, the one that you're going to spend the most time making look nice. Generally, if you're in a studio environment, you're going to be concentrating on the key. Unless it's an enormous set, well, then you're going to say, okay, well, how can I make the background look and feel? And that's the room tone aspect. And we're going to talk about that specifically more in the next section. The other scenario is on location. And when you're on location, the point of control, it doesn't matter if you're shooting an interior or an exterior. More often than not, the point of control that you have the least amount of control over is the sun, or another way, because generally you're not putting the sun in the actual frame unless it's for an artistic purpose, like if you want to do a crazy silhouette or something. It's the sun, it's actually the sky, right? If I want to bring the level down on the sky, I can only do that through the box, right? I can only shift the box. I can only set a cap on how much light is physically hitting the sensor to bring down the level of the sky. I can't do any tricks or things with lighting to be able to manipulate the sky level. So if I can't do that, I'm going to have to find another way to manipulate every other value in the scene. So it becomes very important for distribution to, even if I know my exact ratios, if I can't get one element into that distribution bucket that I would like, well, then that's a problem, right? It's a problem I can't overcome if I don't identify it early enough. And when I do identify it, well, then it becomes about how can I set the box on this sliding scale? How can I set the box in the right spot so the point of control, the thing that I can't control, doesn't require any work or requires very little work to set it at the level that I want? And it can be a little bit confusing to say this stuff out loud, but I think once we jump into the specific scenarios and I walk you through how this process works, then you're going to see why this is so valuable, and you're going to see why it's going to save you so much time. Like, before this had occurred to me, before I had finally put two and two together about, like, I am wasting a tremendous amount of time trying to, fit the round peg in the square peg in the round hole. It's just not going to work. I need something else. And this point of control idea was what really unlocked all of the possibilities, or all of the work that I had been doing before in the false color, in the light meter stuff, to then be able to take it and maximize it on set. So in these next sections, we're just going to go over the two different scenarios. We're going to look at some studio stuff, and studio doesn't have to be physically in the studio. It's just where, again, on some location work, like you're going to see, we have complete control because of the size of the shot, or the size of the scene, or the size of the location, or even the size of the window that's looking outside. So studio, in my head, I think total control. That's going to come with its own point of controls, like its own typical point of controls, right? Sometimes they could be different, but generally speaking, there's only really three. And then we're going to look at on-location stuff, which is going to be the sky. So I call one key plus and the other sky plus. It's just from my own memory, but those are the options. And we're going to explore what to do then for the distribution after we decide where to set this box of exposure. All right, first up, we're going to look at location work, and this is Sky Plus, the Sky Plus model. We know that we're going to be on location. There are certain things that we cannot control. The biggest thing that we can't control becomes the point of control, which means that is what sets our box levels. That means aperture, ND, shutter speed, all those things that we originally talked about earlier in the course. We're going to set those based off of where we want the sky to be. And remember, we've decided where we want the sky to be in pre-production by coming up with this thing that we're going to judge our results against, or judge our on-set activity against. The closer we can get to that, the better we are at coming up and mastering exposure. So let's jump in here to Resolve, just to look at a couple examples, because it can be used a bunch of different ways. The first one that we're going to look at is, hopefully, actually, if we just turn on false color here, we're going to slide through just a few of these images. This is just for my reel, and I chose my own reel because I know this is how I do it, and I know exactly how these levels were set. But anytime you're watching any other material, this is how it's done. I can't think of another way to do it, or how you would do it, so this by default then has to be the way. But I wanted to choose my own stuff just because I know exactly what's happening here. So in a situation like this, we are outside exterior. Let's see if we can make this bigger. If we go like this and make it bigger. Okay. So we're doing this. This is, distance-wise, it's not too dissimilar to everything we've talked about before, right? We've always talked about this sort of distance, this sort of frame, but what elements are we leaving out? Well, let's imagine for a second that we decided, okay, we want something moody. We don't want it to be too high key. Okay, moody and not high key means I would like my sky, or I would like my whole image a little bit under. Right? I want everything a little bit under. So I know there's going to be lots of dark in the frame. So that's the image that I have in my head that we're measuring everything against. Knowing that, what do I have the least amount of control over in the scene? This is a lady here. She's a photographer. She's taking a picture of this downtown scene, and we are behind her looking at this downtown scene. Anything. I mean, it's such a huge, expansive area that we're looking at. I'm not going to be able to manipulate the background at all. Number one, we didn't have the time, we didn't have the crew, we didn't have the budget. Okay, so how can we still ensure that it's not all filly and there's still some shape and there's still some mood to it? I mean, it's a bright, sunny day in Hong Kong. How are we able to create this mood? Well, we identify the point of control. And the point of control is the sky here, right? The sky. And on a sliding scale, we can place this sky, if this is, let's say that this is middle gray here, and this is our scale of exposure, we can place it here, or we can place it here, or we can place it here. And then that will affect all of our other decisions for lighting, right? If we place it all the way up here, and we put in a whole bunch of neg, well, then you're gonna have this giant, if this is a histogram, right? You're gonna have this giant contrasty image with this big gap in the middle, because we're gonna have a really hot sun, and then we're really hot sky, and then we're gonna have a really dark area where we're putting all this neg around the camera. So I will say the only lighting that we're doing for this entire shot, or this scene in general, is we just put a whole bunch of neg behind the camera. I think it was two 12 by 12s that we've just put right behind, sorry, the talent, not the camera. Well, behind the camera as well. But all of the exposure, now we wanted to be wide open for this. This is shot on master anamorphics. Knowing that, we want the sky to be really far down, because that is the look that we are going for. So instead of putting the sky, let's say this is 70 IRE, right here, we're gonna put it at 50. Now that makes it seem really, really dark, but there's no way that we could set this, let's say at normal exposure in here, right? Normal exposure for the photographer, and have the sky this low, right? It's just not possible. We don't have the tools to manipulate the levels inside of the scene to do that. So what do? We say, okay, we know we can't control the sky in the monitor, right? Or you could do this with, if you're using a light meter, you could just spot meter the sky. You spot meter the sky, or you just look on the monitor, and you are, to do this the quickest, you're just taking the aperture, and you're going, okay, if we are wide open, and this is way too bright wide open, right? This is gonna be completely blown out wide open. And this is before you put in ND. You go with whatever ISO you're going for with the project. You go whatever shutter speed, whatever frame rate you're going with the project. Then you just open up the lens to wide open, and then you just close it down until you're happy with the level of the sky. You don't care about anything else. We don't care about anything else in the image. It's just the point of control. because whatever we can't control, whatever the point of control is, that, by definition, requires the most amount of work to overcome if we want it a different way. So we're going to set it exactly how we want it. So we set this exactly how we want it. Let's say, I don't know, let's say this is, we want it at 8s. So if we are spot metering this, we're going to say that this reads like 11, so we're going to put it at an 8. So now we know if we're going to be wide open, we know the exact amount of ND that we're going to have to put in to bring this down with the levels that we are working with here. And then now it's about, okay, we have set our box. We've set our box based on the point of control. And what you will find is if you want the sky this dark, what's going to happen? Let's just imagine this is the sky now, right? This is middle gray, right? What's going to happen is everything else is going to be really dark in the frame. Okay, it's going to be really, really dark because the sky, the ratio to everything else is the exact opposite in real life, right? This would be the hottest thing in the frame. So then we need to do other things locally to help solve this, depending on the look that you're going for. For our purposes here, it worked out well because we want it to be darker in the foreground. So we want to bring even more neg in here to suck up even more light. There's so much, because it's a sunny day in Hong Kong, you can imagine. The sun is over here, right? You can almost see it on this building over here. And it's bouncing into the sky, so you're just getting this big ambient soft light. There's so much fill around here that we want to eliminate as much of that fill as we can. So we just identify the point of control, set the exposure there, set the aperture to see what stop or how many stops of ND we're going to need, put that amount of ND in, and then we start to manipulate the areas that we can get away with, which in this case was locally around the camera with a couple of large 12x12s. Okay, next we're going to go to another example. Here, if we just buzz on false color real quick, you'll see there's nothing in this upward zone because I like things a little bit down. I specifically like car interiors even further down than I like normal, what I would, quote unquote normal exposures. I like it even a little bit further down in car interiors. That's just me, especially because I don't like the blown out look in the background here. But what we are doing here is, okay, what is going to take the most amount of work to control? Well, we can't control the background at all, right? And again, sometimes people get confused because they think point of control and they think the brightest thing in the image or the largest amount of bright area inside the frame, which in this case would be this level here, right? This is the actual sun. Again, let's go a little bit bigger. This is the actual sun, right? Hitting here. Most people think, okay, that's the point of control. No, it's not that. It's what would take the most amount of work to overcome. Like we can't fix the background. Here, we could fix this level that is coming inside the car, this sun. Like we could run maybe another 4x frame outside there. We're working, this is shot on a low loader. So we could rig some sort of diffusion. There's nothing we could do to the background. So the background is the point of control. So again, same workflow as before. You set it up in the brightest area that you're going to get, the sunniest area that this car is going to be traveling on. And as you're driving down the road, as you're setting things up, you just say, okay, I'm just going to take a reading as we're finding the route or whatever it is that we're doing. I'm going to take a reading in the brightest part, and I'm going to set that for the level that I want in the background, which is my point of control. Then that is going to set my box. Again, let's imagine middle gray is just here. And this bright sunny area here, that I don't want it at 90 IRE. I don't like that look. This is going to be a little bit moodier. So I'm going to put it at 60, right? Which is really, really darkened down. Again, making this one decision to set the box. And when I say set the box, generally what's happening here is because remember, I'm using the aperture ring on the lens to set this level really quickly. And when I do that, what you're doing then is you're not going to leave the aperture there. You're going to then load up with ND in front of the lens to get you back there because we want to tell the frame, we want to tell the image, we want to dictate onto the scene what aperture we use because that is a creative decision. Having one stop of ND or having 6 stops of ND, you're not changing the creativity or the creative aspects of the image, right? You were just physically limiting light from hitting the sensor. So definitely, when in doubt, first thing, load up crazy with ND before you do anything else, right? Even though we're using different tools to get there, we're using ND to actually limit the light that is coming into the sensor. So once you set this, again, middle gray, now this is the sky on our sliding scale of 0 to 100 IRE. Once we set that, now we know what kind of level it's going to take to distribute the stops to where we want them. Because this is going to be it's going to be really, really dark inside, right? Spoiler alert, if you like the same images that I like, you're always going to be pushing light into a scene like this, right? Very rarely are you going to have to take away through diffusion or through, for key light, I say. We're going to have to be adding level most of the time to get darker images, which is a little bit counterintuitive. It certainly was to me. You'd think, okay, if I want it darker, I'm going to be mostly taking away light. Well, no, that's not the case, especially when we're setting the point of control much lower than it naturally is, right? Well, now we need to add a bunch of light because everything has shifted down, right? Imagine, again, that this is the scale of a normal exposure. Like, let's say, this is black and this is where the sky should be, and we're inside this box, but this is it. Now what we're doing is we're moving everything like this down. So now what we have to do is we have to bring these levels up, right, to smush them in here. So it smushes like this now, right? So we're taking this big extreme, we're shifting it down by shifting the box down, and then we're pumping level back into these shadows, not to make them not shadows, but to make that distribution just a little bit more finessed, a little bit rounder. Again, if we're thinking in histogram terms, generally speaking, the images sort of look like that, right? Where I would be concerned if the image looked like this, unless I was doing some silhouette, right? Multiple humps, that's a danger in the histogram, I would say. So again, identify point of control, then worry about the distribution inside of that. So distribution, always secondary. Let's go to another one. Again, here, same thing. Like in this situation, it's the reflection. Even though the sky is not really in this, I mean, it is to a certain extent up there, but here it's the reflection. Everything else is based on that. All the different lighting tricks are based on that point of control. Here, outside, it's the sky. Set up the sky, and then even here in these blacks, there's so much light added to these blacks to get them out of clipping and into this range. That is the trick. Again, here, there's no sky, okay? And actually, this is a good one to look at a little bit further. If I come in here and just make it a little bit bigger. Okay, there's no sky here, but I've already set the exposure in the last frame, right, which is looking out of the garage. Now that I'm looking into the garage, the hardest thing to manipulate isn't the sun, right, because the sun is over here. The sun isn't the hardest thing to manipulate. It's actually the level of the garage, because the garage is this huge space. Like, how are we going to get light in there? So even within a given scene or a setup, you have to change points of control. So again, just for our own purposes here, let's go back. This one, point of control, sky. Actually, probably. Well, yeah, it's the sky and the whole ground, right? Because you can't do anything about this entire area. We cannot manipulate it at all. So that's your point of control. After that, though, when we switch in the same location, we just switch angles. Well, now the point of control is here, this background, right? And now we're going to do the opposite. Whereas before we were getting rid of light because it was so dark, now because we're looking into this black hole, we can actually bring down the level of the sun through diffusion. We can put in some shape by adding some neg. We can put in some backlight very easily, versus we cannot light up the inside of this garage at all. So what do? You put the camera down, you adjust the aperture with no ND in there until you get the level of the garage that you like, and then you start to manipulate all the different levels inside of that box. Okay, so hopefully this is becoming a little bit clearer on how this stuff gets done. Let's go to another one, same angle. This, the same project as before. setting up here for the sky. Everything else falls naturally. Same here. All right, we've looked at this one before. Set the sky to what you want, and then that determines how much bounce or how much level you need in here. Right? All of these, everything that I'm doing with false color on set on the day is, and this is a job that I heavily leaned on false color because we were outside in the bright sun. It's like getting a good look on a monitor, even on a balanced, well-crewed set. It can be really, really hard to get a good look at a monitor unless you're sitting in a tent. You know, if you've got operators, it gets a little bit easier. If you've got a full-time DIT, it gets easier. But let's be honest, most of us don't have those resources all of the time. So best to come up with a workflow that allows you to achieve results that you're happy with without those things. Because if it only gets easier, well, then you can do it in the hardest time. That's good for you. Again here, set the level to the sky. That's what you can't control. Then start to manipulate the levels. So here I would say, well, if we're thinking about workflow, set the level to the sky, then you set the bounce level. And why do you set the bounce level next, or what I would call the key level? All right, let's move in here. Again, let's move a little bit closer. We're setting the key level because it's the hardest, it's the second hardest thing to make, number one, look nice, number two, make look realistic. You could easily get way more level here. If we used, I don't know, you could use like a 4x4 mirror and you could get tons of level. It's gonna look horrendous. It's not gonna look natural at all. And it's gonna be quite a setup to make it look nice. So the second hardest thing to make it look nice, once we've set the sky, is this key level. So I'm gonna work on the key level next, followed by the fill level, right? Now, I know I'm going to need some shape. So it's not like these things don't happen, well, they happen at separate times if you're doing this all by yourself. If you're with a crew though, the more heads up you can give them, the more speed they're going to be able to employ these things with. So I would say, okay, we're definitely gonna need a bounce. We're definitely gonna need some neg. Build both, focus on the bounce first. So I wouldn't even care about the fill. Knowing that this 12x12 over here, this neg was getting built, as long as you see it getting built, well, then you know it's gonna fly in. It doesn't take long to set. And it definitely doesn't take long to set once we have the key in the right spot. If we don't have the key in the right spot and you set the neg first, well, now you're making it harder on yourself because now you're putting like the finishing salt and pepper on the contrast without setting the big element, which is the key light. So point of control, key, fill, and then here there's no backlight, right? The backlight is oftentimes on location work. When you're dealing with a Sky Plus scenario, I do a backlight with the neg itself. So I will, imagine that there is neg running this way. Okay, well then that's gonna block out all of the light from hitting the glasses here. But if the neg is at an angle like this, well, it knocks out all of this light, but it still leaves a little bit here, right? So I'll do the backlight with the actual neg that you're using, whether it's a 12x, whether it's a couple floppies. That's just an easier way to do it. So is there any other for location that I can think of? I think that's it. Oh, here, just an example where, sometimes I would say probably wrong maneuver here, where number one, for reasons that were out of my control, we had to schedule to be at this location when the sun is on this side, behind the camera, and it's blasting right at this white-walled building outside. Number two, the production designer, the art department, they didn't have, these shears were just in place already. So now we can't bring our own shears that have a little bit more thickness because it would be better if, you weren't looking outside because it's distracting out there. It'd be better if it was like a white, but we couldn't make it white and still have this amount of mood inside. So the control here was setting the mood inside. So it's not always the sky. It's whatever's going to take the most amount of work to overcome. So even though it looks like, all I have to do is set the exposure to the window here, that's not what we were doing. We need to set the mood to the atmosphere that we want inside. And once we do that, then we start to manipulate all the distribution values from there. So easy to think, it's always the sky or it's always the exterior windows, but really just constantly be thinking, what can get me 80% there just by adjusting the box, right? You can get 80%, like if you did no amount of lighting here, there's a ton of lighting in this scene, but if you didn't do any lighting, you'd still probably get 75% of this image if you just set the box in the right spot. So the box work, based on that pre-production image that you have in your mind, that does the heavy lifting. Then the distribution takes over in the second half. The second point of control scenario is the Studio Plus environment. Okay, this is where you have control of everything, which generally means you're not looking at the sky. So it doesn't have to physically be in a studio, but again, if we jump into Resolve, I think you're going to see there are some, it's very easy to spot exactly what I'm talking about here. So what is, in a scenario like this, we're in a studio, it's a big, giant studio. There is a white cyc that was purposely built for this commercial. They bring in this little pool. What is the thing that is going to take us the most amount of time to manipulate or to get right? In this scenario, it's actually the key light, right? For this particular commercial, it just so happened that this pool was so large that the key light, and there were so many people that were involved in one of the wider shots, there was multiple people that had to be inside this pool, that the key light was far and away the biggest setup. And if it's far and away the biggest setup, and we can do a whole bunch of little things to manipulate the background with the white cyc, we can do some space light tricks, it's very simple to do that part, well then the point of control becomes the key light. So again, the most amount of work to fix, that's going to be the point of control. Here, this example, we're actually on location, right? And on location, we generally would think that this would be the point of control, except that it's such a small window in this scene that, and it's at nighttime. Actually, this was at daytime. We just had to black out this entire area out here. It's such a small element that now the point of control becomes the key light, right? This key light is going to, and the levels that the key light are at versus the room tone, that becomes the most important thing to get right at the beginning. So to set the box, all I'm doing in a situation like this is I'm not caring about the window, because there's 5 different ways to get the exact level that I want on that window, because it's blacked out or it's tinted, right? So I could leak a little bit in the tint. I could actually light the window itself, which is what we did in the end. I could use a net on there. I could use ND. There's lots of fast ways to take care of that window level. There's not lots of fast ways after we've set the key light at a specific area, and therefore the box of exposure, physically limiting light coming in the sensor, to manipulate the room tone. So to manipulate all of the other ratios of the key to everywhere else in the room. That part's really difficult. So once we identify the point of control here, which is to say the key light with the rest of the room, first step is, okay, turn off all the background lights. Turn off everything. Give me the key light and give me nothing else. Because I want the room tone at essentially 0. And I want the room tone at no values, and then I want to raise and lower that floor based on where I set the box. So a situation like this, it's key plus. Add the key first, and then all of the other elements, right? Practicals last, room tone last. Same with here, same a nighttime exterior, right? We've got this giant set. If we make this bigger, we've got a giant set here, out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of this giant, huge salt flat. And the point of control here is, well, we cannot control how much level the fire is giving off, right? The fire is a real fire. However big or small we make it, those are the levels. Because we cannot control the fire, we have to set everything to this little tiny spot here, right? This gigantic, huge, I mean, this is probably, what, I don't know, 300 feet across in the background, 100 meters in the background across, and all of it, the entire exposure is set off of the fire and the amount of level that is coming onto this guy's face, right? So we've got a giant cherry picker up here that's blasting this 12K into the background. We've got this huge 20 by 20 or 12 by 12 cherry picker up here with a couple of cream sources or a couple of sky panels shooting through diffusion, adding these local shadows here, all based on this little tiny thing that we can't control. So again, it's not physical space, it's ability to manipulate and the difficulty to manipulate. In this case, you cannot manipulate fire. So if you have fire in a scene, guess what? That's your point of control. So now all of the exposure decisions that we have to make are based around the fire, or if you don't mind blowing out the fire, then it's about this ratio here between the fire and this person's face here, because that is what you cannot control. Same here, we're in this big, Pretty much. The bigger you get on backgrounds, whether it's on set or on location, if you can't see the sky, the size and scope of the background becomes the hardest element to manipulate. And there will be some situations where that's not the case, where you have ample budget, you've got ample time, you've got ample people, and you can really impose your will on the background. But the level of jobs that I work on, and what I would imagine when you're just starting out in this business, the level of jobs that you will be working on, you have, maybe you can do something with the key, you can do something, with this light here, you can do something with the fill, you can bring in a 12 by 12, maybe you might be able to bring in like a little backlight here. But lighting an enormous giant space like this, when you're doing 2 commercials in a day and you're doing 25 setups, you're just not gonna have the resources. So the most important skill for exposure then becomes about identifying point of control and setting this box. Because again, the distribution happens after you have set that box. Okay, another example here, again, just the same scene. Now we're just closer. As we get closer, these are 2 little tiny lamps here, one there and one this way, giving us this key light, and then some neg here. All of this here is done through turning some lights on and off at the location. And this you can do on the Scout, which again is where if you do have a light meter, it comes in handy to be able to just spot meter things as lights are going on and off, because sometimes when you're on a location Scout, people will be very friendly. You'll have lots of access to different lights and different panels that you can switch on and off. Sometimes people, they don't care that you're shooting a commercial in there. They just work in this building and you're annoying them trying to flick on lights, flick off lights, trying to come up with different setups. They're not gonna have all the time in the world. So the faster and the more accurate you can be with a little light meter, this is when you would be getting it out. When you're deciding, okay, you walk into this big giant gym, we're gonna be shooting a basketball game in here. You don't have the resources to be able to impose your will here. Okay, well, I need to set the point of control first. So, and you can set that well in advance of anybody else being here without a camera, as long as you have the information of how much light is in that space and then what you want it to look like. Because then, in your mind, you can set the box, right? You can set that distribution of physical light hitting the sensor. Same here, again, just a nighttime, night interior example. When you don't see the sky, it's like, well, the point of control then becomes the overall tone, the overall room tone, because that's going to take the most amount of work to manipulate. Our little backlight here, our little key light coming from this side, those things are quick and easy fixes. What's not a quick and easy fix is to raise or lower the total room tone ambient. And then finally, again, like a little bar scene. Here I would say, did we get it wrong? I think this is a little bit earlier in my career. Looking at it now, I would say it kind of feels, why does it feel lit? Especially these 2 characters here. Why do they feel lit versus everything else? I would say that the box is not in the right spot. I'd say the distribution, I like the distribution on the face. I like the key to fill ratio. I like the little backlight here. But I would say, does it sit? Does the key action fit in with the overall picture? I would say, if I could do it again, do I maybe just bring those 2 a little bit closer, right? Do I open up a little tiny bit for the background and clamp down a little bit of the movie lights that are just off to the side lighting everybody in the foreground here? I think I do. But it's those little tiny things that add up. But this is a location. This is a bar or location, but there's no sky. So then the point of control really does become the room tone or the key light, whichever is bigger to set up. So hopefully that helps to just shed some light on where to start with this information. Just because you've done the light meter testing, just because you've done the false color stuff, to then be able to implement it on set, you have to have this workflow. And that's why I say, definitely keep track with notes about how you implement this stuff and what's easiest for you to do it, because probably, more likely than not, you're not going to come up with the same system as I do for the size of crews that you work with or the speed at which you have to work with. If you're doing documentary, if you're doing corporate, if you're doing anything like that, you're going to be up against different constraints than what I am under. Or if you're doing feature film stuff, it's a different world on every set. So the better you can get with being able to take this information that you've learned and that you've honed, and those, the end of the flow chart that you have arrived at, you still have to get there on the day, even if you know that stuff. The hard part is getting there on the day. That's why it's still fun for me to go out there and do it. I can imagine those images in my head, but to actually get them, that is the creation process, which makes the job So much fun. So hopefully this implementation process, it doesn't look like rocket science. It's not. It's fairly simple. It's fairly straightforward. There's not a lot to remember. If you do your homework early on, you can start to see some pretty rapid improvements. At least that is the theory behind it. But one piece of advice that I would offer here that I certainly did not follow was going too hard, too soon with too many different elements, too many variables. Because no matter how you set it up, no matter how much pre-production work you do, no matter how dialed in your ability to judge levels are, still there is this process of manipulating all of those levels, no matter how well they're set up by the team, by the crew, no matter how big it is, no matter how many people you have standing by ready to manipulate things. The film set is a crazy, hectic, chaotic space where you will be pulled in 100 different directions. And if I could give you any advice, it would say at the beginning, or even as you progress through your career, like I can measurably see how good the results are. I mean, what I would consider good exposure, based on how many different variables I have to juggle at any one time. So while there are 4 key elements that we talk about when we're analyzing stuff, key, fill, backlight, background, the less of these 4 variables you have to contend with, I think the easier it is to get a quality outcome. So I would say, do yourselves a favor and be realistic about your expectations to be able to manage 4 different things, 4 different elements. Once you learn this point of control system, really, if you learn point of control and you're on location, you've taken care of the background. So then it's about key to background ratio, right? That becomes the really important one. Then, okay, fill, you can do a lot with a little. For fill, backlight, that takes a lot of time. That takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of forward understanding of how much am I actually going to be able to manipulate my background to key ratio, so then to measure which fixture I need to have or act as a backlight. If I'm going to bring in an electric backlight, not use a balance, not use a mirror, that requires quite a bit of understanding and knowledge. And I would say that if you could avoid having to produce a lot of knowledge, that's going to be more beneficial for you. It certainly would have been for me, because you can easily get carried away with the details. And I made the mistake early on in my career of focusing on really trying to get the exact, what you see is what you get, like distribution of stops, distribution of values that were in that false color. And what ended up happening is I probably went slower. The setup times took longer, which even though the images were okay, I think the directors and the rest of the productions were slowed, which ultimately led to me probably not getting as much work had I been a little bit faster. So that happened over time. It's like realizing, well, actually, a little backlight thing, that's not near as important as just giving the director 10 extra minutes. Then it becomes about your knowledge of on-set awareness and what is and what is not important, and having those conversations in pre-production. It's a whole nother course in and of itself. But I would say, just generally speaking, especially if you're starting out, try and focus on 1 or 2 of those relationships on set and be realistic about how much you're going to be able to control those things, and then focus on getting better at doing those. Because it's very easy to sit here and look at these images or look at somebody else's images and go, oh, I see the exact ratio. Like, that makes sense. But then to be able to carry it through an entire scene with multiple different angles, multiple different cameras, like, this is not easy. If it was as easy as me explaining this stuff and just deciding on where you want to sit in the flow chart of ratios, well, then everyone would have phenomenal work. But the fact is, it's maybe 1%, and 1% would be, I think, on the high side of people who I think do really good work. So to get there, I would say just limit your options as much as you can, or limit the variables. And that will allow you to focus a lot more on what you can manipulate to get the best results. By now, in this course, you have learned everything there is to learn about exposure. Now it's about repetition to make it second nature, so you can go out and you can never be caught off guard as to how you're going to expose or the ways in which you want to get an exposure that you are chasing. All of those questions now are answered. It's just about getting it into your mind so that you no longer have to think about it, so you can devote those resources somewhere else. But if you want to get maximum results, if you want to get maximum juice from the squeeze of doing all of these exercises, of doing all of the pre-production beforehand to decide on what images you're going to get, to go through the process of doing the light meter, tests and viewing the results and monitoring which area of the flowchart you want to occupy for a specific project, if you want to go through all the false color studies, there is one extra step that you're going to want to do that was impossible before, 2013? Maybe that this became possible. And it's easy to take for granted now just how much easier it is to get good at cinematography than it was before. And that is with your ability on any computer that you have to run DaVinci Resolve and be able to have a post-production studio at the palm of your hands, right? At your fingertips. You can do so many amazing things, the least of which is analyzing the results that you have gone out and shot. So I have done hundreds of commercials in my day, and 99% of the value that I have been able to extract from those commercials as it pertains to learning about exposure and getting better at the job of cinematography has not come from viewing the final commercials on television, right? That's almost zero. Number one, it doesn't tell me anything about what I'm actually doing as a job. It shows what are the results when pushed to the limit that you can extract from the footage. But that is besides me, right? That's past your job at that stage. That's how much can be built around the footage that you have been able to capture. To get the maximum benefit, you need to be looking at all of the footage, or at least this is what I consider a good way forward, is to be looking at all of the footage that you get, no matter what the scene is, no matter what the setup is, to see whether or not the results that you had predicted beforehand match up with what you were able to get on the day. And if not, where the holes are in the exposure approach. Is it because we set the box in the wrong spot? Is it because the distribution was lacking? Is it because that mood didn't fit the particular narrative that we were chasing? All of these things can and should be looked at inside of DaVinci Resolve. So post-production, if you are going to complete this circle, at least being competent in a few different areas inside of Resolve, we're not going to learn how to be colorists. Here, we don't need to do that. There's other people who have skills and who have interests that can help to boost the things that we do on set. They can go far and beyond what we are capable of doing. And this is coming from someone that was, at one point in time, paid to color other people's work. I don't consider myself a colorist at all. I can fumble around on the tools, but fumbling around on the tools is not what's important. What's important is taking the time to go through this step and understanding what things do you want to be looking for in post-production. What are the things that I want to be analyzing to make sure I am getting better as a cinematographer, and by that I mean getting better at exposure. So that is what we're going to look at in this section. We're going to jump into Resolve just very briefly and talk about what things you should be looking for when you are reviewing footage. And if you're not reviewing footage, all of the footage from whatever shoot it is that you're doing, I think you're leaving gains on the table. You're leaving a golden opportunity to get better as a cinematographer on the table if you are not doing this stuff. So I would highly encourage you, this is not a necessary step, but think about the advantage that it gives you over anyone pre-2013. It just wasn't possible before. Think about how long you would have had to wait between drinks if you were doing even something as basic as the light meter test, right? To get back the results, to be able to process that information. Now you can do it instantly. Now you can go out, you can shoot a commercial, you can come back that evening, you can view on your hard drive, you can view the footage, and you can immediately be making changes for day 2. Right? Like, this is unheard of. It seems so easy now and it's so convenient, but the pace at which you can learn and then modify and go out and reiterate on the tools that we're working on here, this is just, it's a golden opportunity that you can't pass up. In my opinion, you cannot push this to the side and say it's not important, because oftentimes you'll hear people say, well, it's just so important to get out there and shoot and shoot and shoot. And yes, that is true. The more exposure that you have on set to the job itself, and to putting these things in practice, to putting these flowcharts into practice and communicating with the crew, all those things make a huge difference. But if we're not analyzing the output of all of that combined effort, if we're not analyzing the output, then what are we doing in the first place? How are we actually measuring results? And it can't just come from the footage that ends up in the final short, or the footage that ends up in the final commercial, or the feature film, whatever it might be, because all of that, again, 99% of the stuff that I have that I would show anyone doesn't actually make it into the final project. That's somebody else's job. That's somebody else's domain. I wouldn't even consider that the work. The work is in the stuff that I am proud of, right? That is where I'm putting my effort into making those segments better, so that the people who do decide what goes in the final project, we're giving them the best range of options that we have at our fingertips. So in this section, we're just briefly going to jump into Resolve, and I'll show you a few different areas where to look. If you have followed along in the past with the podcast or the YouTube channel, you might have seen some of these tricks before, but we're just going to go over them again in a very broad fashion so that you have some point of reference when you're looking at the output of your projects to be able to help you get better as fast as you can with as little input as possible. It's just a way to draw people's attention to All right, so let's now jump into Resolve and show you what I think is the number one thing you should be looking at anytime you review any of your footage to be able to track whether or not you're getting better at exposure. There's tons of different ways that you can go about this. This is the most effective that I have found to very quickly and accurately measure how good my skills are getting at judging and therefore adjusting exposure on set, both in the box form and in the distribution phase. But really, the distribution phase is what we're talking about here now. So this is just a still inside of Resolve. I have chosen one that is going to be an exterior, and then we'll do one that's an interior, or one, if you remember back to what we talked about in the last section, one that is Sky Plus and one that is Studio Plus. So here we do not have control of the sky. So remember how we're adjusting exposure levels now, right? That's the technique that we did on set. And now in the calm of post-production, we're going to get in here and analyze how good are we at controlling that exposure. Because what I find over time is the number one relationship that we have to keep track of, the number one ratio that we need to always be working towards to get images that I find myself drawn to more and more is the background to key ratio, right? And I'm not talking about different areas of light and dark. I'm just talking about the general feel. Does the key light, does the key level fit in with that background level? And I find the more and more I look at images across my career, the more I am drawn to images where that ratio sits in the right area. And it's hard to explain, but the more and more images you look at and see, I find myself drawn to this very particular relationship and this very particular ratio. So what I want to do here is you have to imagine yourself as a busy cinematographer in the future where you're looking for these incremental wins over time. You're looking for your exposure mastery to gain in strength from job to job. And you're going to be looking at a large number of images. And there's so many things you can do inside of Resolve, right? You can manipulate different things, but this is not a course on being a colorist. This is a course on can we be objective in our analysis of our own images to see whether or not we are getting the levels that we are after and whether or not we're getting better at judging those levels. And this is the best method I have found for it. And that method is very similar to what I would do if I was going to be a colorist, right? I want to check the background to the key relationship. And the more adjustments I have to make to get an image that I'm happy with, the further I am on set of actually getting those ratios in the right spot. And then if we know that to be true, then we can work backwards and see, okay, well, why is that? What was I doing incorrectly? Or what was I doing? What am I thinking now that I wasn't thinking then? Was it because the monitor environment that I was looking in, I wasn't able to accurately gauge contrast? Was it because I wasn't using false color? Was it because I wasn't using a spot meter? These are all things that can contribute to this area blowing out. So the way that I would do this is the squeeze and drop method. If you followed along with the podcast or the YouTube tutorials, you have seen this before. I used to use it all the time. I still do. It's just a way to draw people's attention to an area of the frame that you want them to look, and it's not heavy-handed. Right? The whole goal of all of these things, really with any post-production that you're doing, if you're going to be your own colorist, is the more you have to do in post, I would say the less you got on the day. And getting less on the day isn't a problem if you can facilitate a transfer to someone who knows what they're doing in the post-production process. But if you're working in the commercial space, you don't have any say in that. You need to give them, or it's wisest to give them as close to what you envisioned on set on the day as much as possible. So I would say any manipulation of the image here, we want to be as broad as possible. Because yes, of course, if we come in here and let's go here, we could very easily in Resolve, we could key this area and take it up. And we could key this area and take it down. And we could even, you could even add like a little backlight. You can do so much now. We can take down the area of the background. We can take down specific chunks of it. But those are minute changes to the image that will have an impact. But by far the most we can do for judging what we got on set is the broadest stroke possible. And this is the broadest stroke possible. So we're going to highlight the subject, right, just with the window. Then we're going to select an outside node, right? You're just going to right click here. You're going to come down to add node and you're going to add outside. And then this outside node is where we're going to make the changes in level. So if we come here and we shift it off, this is where I got the grade to when I was doing my reel, however many years ago. This is from 2018, I think. So you can see down here, the squeeze is that we're going to take the highest levels and the lowest levels, and we're going to squeeze them together. Right? We're going to squeeze them closer and closer and closer, put a clamp on the top and bottom. And then we are going to drop the level using offset. So you see, I just do this by using contrast here. If we turn this back on, you can see we're just using contrast here, and you see the background, right? And this is essentially what we're doing on set. Like, this is the vision that you should be having on set is, okay, I have this area. What do I want that background to look like versus this foreground? And in a sky plus environment, we're doing the opposite, right? We're doing the sky first. So we're going to set the levels. Let's come back here and go to 1. We're going to set the level of the sky. Like, where do we want the sky through exposure? It feels good right about there. Okay, that feels pretty good. Okay, so now what we're going to do is let's now adjust the foreground, right? We're adjusting the contrast to make sure you're not clipping or anything like that. That's what you're doing on the day. Here now, we're going to analyze the images. We're seeing, well, what is the difference between what we got on the day and what we want to ultimately achieve. And what we want to ultimately achieve is what we can do here, because we can be much more detailed and nuanced. So for our sake, okay, let's see. If we come here and go to timeline, we'll be able to see false color. And then we're going to come back here, go to clip, and we will toggle this on and off and just see what happens in the background. All right, we're looking here in the background, and we're going to use, let's see, if there's this part of the building is green, right? That's there. We're going to see where that green was at the start. Okay, I imagine it's going to get darker when we apply. And if we come and take that off, okay, so what's happening here is all of the background is getting darker. And we're just doing this by eye. So let's come here and take that off now. Okay, and then we'll come back to clip. So now for here, what happens is it's just settling in a little bit. Is it too heavy-handed now? Looking at it, I'd say it probably is too heavy-handed. Okay, so let's come back up here. Let's see, something like that. I'm just getting that balance, and you can see what's happening over here on the waveform, right? You're seeing how these levels jump if we adjust them. All right, it just goes a little bit of clamp and down. What we're doing there is we're seeing the ratio between the key and the background. And this is almost all of the work. And it's certainly all of the heavy lifting. Like the fill, and in this case, there's no backlight, which you'll often see. Like many times there won't be a backlight. Well, I guess there is here on the same side. It's actually from the sun. But you're not going to have an opposite backlight. You're not going to have these huge lighting setups sometimes. Sometimes it's just key to background and matching those two layers up. So the workflow is you load in all of the footage. And again, it has to be, in my mind, it cannot be the footage that you see in the end spot. Because that end spot, that's the product of so many other people's work. If you just work on a commercial and then you see it come out on television, or you see the spot online, there's very little information you can pull away from that as to whether or not you're getting better. And I think, at least for myself, I need that constant feedback, especially in a profession that allows for it. It's like there's no question about whether or not you got exposure right. The proof is in the files themselves. So again, I would do everything that I possibly could to get access to those files. And then when I get them, I'm going to take them into Resolve. And this is the only test I'm going to run. Like the key and the fill, I mean, sometimes I guess if you're just starting out, you could play around with, maybe I should have gone a little bit darker here. But if you switch on false color, you don't even need to do that, right? If you switch on false color, you don't have to play with the windows to adjust key and fill. You can just look and say, you know what? Like I like the look. I definitely like the key, but it would have been more dramatic if I had more down level here. And I know so this shouldn't be, there shouldn't be any green on this side except for this little cheek. Like there's too much fill coming in here. And by removing all the variables except for the one ratio, that has over time in my career allowed me to track whether or not I'm getting better. At the same time, what it does is, part of the job of a cinematographer is to be able to decide on set where to allocate energy and what is going to have the largest impact. And I think nowadays when there is a tool as cost effective as Resolve, which means it's free, it's just your time to go through the images to learn what cameras can do, there'll be times where you can save so much, or you can divert so much unnecessary energy away from, things like, taking down the level of this building on set, or you can imagine in a smaller environment. Maybe when we get to the next scene, I'll talk about, how you can save time by just becoming more familiar with exposure in Resolve, because the job isn't done when you get done shooting a day, right? The job is done when the thing gets fully produced on the back end, or when you hand over. This is the vision that I saw for this project. This is how I would go about doing it. And that means you have to allocate scarce resources on set. And that could either be time, it could be energy from the crew, it could be equipment, whatever it might be. If you become familiar with these tools, and you become familiar, because sometimes it won't be squeeze and drop, right? Sometimes you will have gone too far down in the background. So if we come back here and let's do clip, right? If you're properly experimenting, sometimes it'll look like this when you actually get the file. You will have gone too extreme on the ratios. So you'll then have to flatten it out. And knowing how much you can get away with, that makes you a better cinematographer, because now you can make better choices on set. Say, don't worry about that background. I know that we can affect it later on quicker than we can do now. So my suggestion to the director or to the producer or whoever might be involved is to move on, allocate resources elsewhere. So these tools, they make you better at exposure, but they make you better at being a cinematographer as well, because we're learning this entire pipeline. And I would say there's certainly value in getting out there, and like what everybody says, shoot as much as you possibly can. But if you're not going through this process of looking at the objective end results, like how well did you do? And then circling back and go, okay, well, why, if this is no good, right? If we take this off and you're not happy with this outcome, what let us down? Was it the setting of the box? What let us down? Was it the setting of the box? Right? Did we set the box, again, in this example, if we have our line of exposure here, and this is middle gray, and this is where we've got the sky, should we have put it here, right? Should it have been just a piece of ND that should have gone in, one more stop of ND, and then we could have gotten, were we wasting some of the bounce that's over here? This 12 by bounce that the sun is coming off of and hitting him in the face? Should that have been a different direction? Should that have been a different play? Like, these are the things I think have been the most beneficial for me, is after the fact, going through, making the step to get the footage, and then making the time to say, well, this is important enough for me to go through these steps because it's going to make me a better cinematographer. And so now that we've seen this Sky Plus option, let's go in and take a look at how this exact same idea, right, of keeping it very, very simple. Imagine yourself super busy. You don't have time to go through the 25 shots that you've just done for a commercial. You don't have time to go through and color every individual frame. You're shooting 5 jobs that month and you've got a lot to look through, but you still want to get better. This squeeze and drop analysis of seeing that key to background ratio, I find myself even now still constantly getting better at doing less and less and less manipulation, and it develops the eye. And just like you're training with looking over those light meter images and working your way to the end of the flow charts of ratios, you're getting better every single time you're analyzing these images, because you're taking the same exact workflow and all of this information, just carrying it over onto set. So now let's take a look at a Studio Plus example to see how this might shift or what priorities might change when you're analyzing that information. So now you've got the concept of why this is going to be beneficial. You've seen how, just like you would repeatedly look at other people's images, it's more important to do that for your own images so you can start to analyze what went wrong. Now we're going to take a look at a Studio Plus example that we have seen before in the past, right? This is actually on location, but again, we blacked out this area. We have complete control of that window. So our biggest problem now is going to be the relationship between the key and the background. So we can adjust two different things on set on the day. We can either affect the background, a lot of work, or the key, very little work. So we're gonna do the one that requires the least amount of work. So now when we're analyzing this and watching it through, the area that we're going to be looking for to gain a better understanding of how accurate we are with our exposure, number one, our exposure desires, as in what was the image or what was the image in our mind or the mood that we were going for in the first place. And that mood, again, is the relationship between the key and the background. Just, again, in overall broad strokes, we don't have to worry about practicals or anything like that at this stage. We're looking for the general fit. And I consider that key to background relationship. That's the fit of the image and the vibe. So that's what we're analyzing for. We're doing the same thing here. We're adding a broad window around. The more broad you can make it, the better. But ideally, just around the subject, adding our outside node, and then we're adding or dropping levels. Right now it's okay, well, that's what we came away with on the day. And that's just a little bit more tucked in. You can see over here, again, we're squeezing and dropping. Now, we're not really squeezing here because there's very little highlights, right? There's very little highlights and there's a lot of level in the shadows anyway. So what we're doing is we're dropping the level around to see maybe, I mean, to me, right now, this feels too flat, right? It feels like there's not enough drawing your eye directly to where it should be looking. So if we do add just that little tiny pull, again, it should be the more subtle, the more that's a sign that you are moving in the right direction. Because if things start to get heavy-handed, and that goes for exposure just in general and lighting in general, the more you start to get worried about, and it's not just with key and background, it's with backlight and fill, the more micro adjustments that I've made on set, usually it's compensating for something else seriously wrong, right? It's the same idea that I often talk about, how if you see me at the camera while we're in the middle of a setup and I start playing with color temperature, or I start playing with any of the things that define the box, right? Any of the, if it's shutter speed, if it's adding more ND, like as we're halfway through a scene, or adjusting the aperture, that's usually code word for something is wrong. And I haven't got it to sit in the right zone in the first place. And so now I'm just trying to make any adjustments that might help just a little bit. And it's the same with adding lights at the end or getting too nuanced as to where it goes. Anytime I get too refined, I find that things fall apart fairly quickly. And this is a fantastic way to view that. It's like without any of the stress of being on set, are you happy with the images that you're getting? If not, why not? Like if you're looking at the false color, and you've grossly overexposed an area or underexposed an area, only you know, right? Only you know why that has occurred. Was it because I didn't do the necessary prep work to set the mood to the location that we had or to the studio set that we had? Is it because I set the box in the wrong spot for some reason? Was did I take an inaccurate reading? Was I looking at a monitor and not using false color? Was I trusting something that I shouldn't have been? Where along those things? I want to know that information before anyone else, right? Because as the cinematographer, you're there to have these solutions to all of these answers. That is your worth. That's your value on set, is to be there to help guide the project to the ultimate destination of the look that you and the director have come up with. So you want to know these things as to why you are further and further away from the image that you have in your head at the start, at the end of a project. Like if it's not working, I want to know those reasons as quick as possible. And the technique that I have found for doing this over the most amount of images, because again, it's about exposure to different environments, to different setups from shot to shot, is this simple squeeze and drop analysis. It's like, am I happy with these levels without doing the squeeze and drop? If I'm more happy with the image just as it is than I am either raising or dropping because of this, well then I would say my skills are getting better and better. And it's a It's a fantastic way to mark out the path and to remain motivated. And so, like I am, you'll see progress. And eventually, you'll get to the point where you probably don't have to do this. You'll probably get so good that you won't need to go through these necessary steps. I still do. I'm not that good. I still get there and think, oh, looking back, is there anything that I could have done differently? Like even my monitors that I've had for years and false color that I have worked off of for years. It's like I'll still get there and say, maybe I should have gone just that little bit more here. But I've also, that entire time I've been doing this, that entire time I've been looking at these things, I'm getting better informed about what can be done later. So that's information that I can pass downstream, which doesn't get me any better at exposure, but it certainly gets a better outcome. It's like, what can we do? Because in the end, what we're doing is we are putting all of the elements in place to hand over, like to be, we're this cog in this wheel, especially in the commercial space, where we're handing over these files, handing over these images to the next person to steward them along until they're done. And can we give them the most amount of information, with the most amount of care and the most manicured package possible, so that it's seen through all the way to the end with our vision intact? Because the more you can do that, and the more repeatable it becomes, and the more predictable it becomes, the more valuable you become as a cinematographer. And I think that leads to more and more jobs. So this is certainly an area that I would not ignore. Yes, go out and shoot, but almost spend more time, especially early on in this phase, looking at where things went wrong, if things did go wrong, by how much, and what do I need to do to make sure that doesn't happen again? It might be a management issue. It might be a crew issue. It might be an equipment issue. It might be a prep oversight. It might be a whole host of things. There's so many different variables that by eliminating all those things and focusing on the squeeze and drop, just A/B, is it better with the squeeze and drop, or is it better without the squeeze and drop? Because if it's better with the squeeze and drop, then I could have done more on set. And if I could do more on set, I need to find out what that might be, what link that might be along the chain to get me to those exposure values and those ratios and that distribution pattern, so that I can get better and do so in a noticeable and repeatable fashion. Just one final word about post-production and resolve and examining your images here. I think, I mentioned it earlier, that this really is the superpower in being able to go out, shoot something the same day, come back and check it to see the results. It just wasn't possible before, and it opens up so many opportunities to you. But I know tons of cinematographers that don't do this. There are lots and lots of individuals that I know personally that have gone out, have shot entire series, and never taken the footage for themselves and had to play around, right? These are experienced cinematographers that will rely on the DITs on set, or will rely on Daly's colorists to be pushing back content to them, which is understandable at a certain level, right? Once you are well familiar with all of the various things that you can and can't do with the footage. But if you're just starting out, and that is the behavior that you see on set from other cinematographers, from people that you look up to, you have to realize what came before that is this constant testing and constant going over of the images to judge how well your skills are developing as a cinematographer. There is no faking getting these ratios in the right spot. And that's why that squeeze and drop analysis is so important, because again, yes, you can do the fill, yes, you can do the backlight, but that key background mixture, like that is when something feels off, I would say 9 times out of 10, it's because of the key to background ratio. I would say it being way off in either scope, as in the values are too high for whatever the given situation might be, or they're too, or the quality of light is so vastly different, right? Which quality of light doesn't really factor into exposure, but you need to know these things, because if it's not exposure, well, then that just leaves quality of light. So again, if you start with this foundation of understanding exposure to the maximum that you can, well, then that starts to eliminate exposure issues. So therefore it must be something else. And so again, just every single shot, every single setup getting better and better. And you can't do that without at least being somewhat of a seasoned practitioner inside of something as easy as Resolve. Like, you just take the images inside, you load up the images, you go over them. The only thing that you should be doing is saying, you don't have to look at the creative. You don't even have to look at the lighting, right? Because you're going to come up with your own limitations. You're going to be on smaller crews. You're not going to have the time. But the one thing that you can constantly be doing is saying, did I set the box in the right place to the point of control? If I did that, okay, well then, did I get the first job done, which is then matching that key to the point of control? And if you don't get that right, well, there's no point putting in the backlight. There's no point getting the shadow side fill in the right spot. Like, we can worry about those things later. We have a huge problem that will solve 80% of our woes if we can just get better at that. So let's start there, get really, really good at that. And the only way to do that is in the calmness of post-production, in your own house, in your own apartment. You can go over these things and say, did I get it right, or did I get it wrong? And if you can be honest with yourself, you're going to start to see this progression happen much more rapidly than any other way I have found at getting better at cinematography. Well, that's about everything I know about exposure. It's everything that I think about when I think in exposure terms, when I approach a project, when I want to develop a plan for what I'm going to do on the next project, for how I want to objectively analyze what I've done in the past to try and get better. And I thought here I would just offer a little bit of advice that I have used or picked up along the way to help me deal with my lack of abilities, especially early on, and then my lack of progress after I found all of these tools and all of these techniques, where eventually you'll get stuck in ruts. What happens when I first was able to identify, okay, false color can be this instrumental tool in making me a better cinematographer, and I can make giant leaps forward without having to do near as much work as was necessary before for other cinematographers to have to do. Once I sort of picked up on that, what happens is you get this huge growth curve, right? This huge uptick in the acceleration of, I'm getting better and better and better results. And you'll see these giant waves of what I didn't think was possible is now possible. I'm starting to understand and grasp some of these concepts. And that in turn is making the work better. So there's this huge wave of motivation. But over time, those large chunks that you're making up and those gaps that you're closing from the images that you want to be creating with the images that you're actually creating, as that closes, it gets harder and harder to close the gap because there's less and less information to take on board and to turn into knowledge that will allow you to close that gap. And I guess my point being is that that never ends. You should see huge upticks if you haven't discovered this information before, or maybe you haven't put it into practice, or maybe you knew that it was necessary to do, you just didn't think it was worth the effort. Hopefully this course has changed your mind or helped sway you into the direction of, yes, this is absolutely beneficial to you. I couldn't have had the career that I have in cinematography without these techniques, without going down this rabbit hole of trying to be very systematic in my approach to exposure. It just wouldn't have been possible. It would have taken a lot longer, and the results would have been far from what I'm able to achieve today, which is, again, not the end of the road, which is why I say I still am doing all of these things. I still take every single setup that I shoot, and I still operate with that squeeze and drop technique to be able to judge, well, how close am I getting? Just to keep me on track as to what's improving and what's not improving, and going through that post-shoot checklist of, okay, well, if it's not quite right, if the ratio, the key to background ratio, if it doesn't quite sit right, why is that? Where was the fault made? Was it in creating the look in the first place? Was it in my directions to the crew? Was it in my reactions in those last 7 minutes to be able to manipulate the values? Was it just a poor creative choice? I'm still doing that today. But know that as those leaps get smaller and smaller in your skill level, that's completely normal, right? There is motivation to go on, and what over the years helped to keep me on track was this constant measuring protocol of just keeping myself honest as much as I could to get that 1% better. Because if you just look at your images as your career spans over years and years and years, it's hard to see improvements in project to project. There's so many different elements and so many different variables that are involved with each and every job that it can be hard to track whether or not you're actually getting better without, lying to yourself and saying, well, there's, X project 10 years ago was nice because we had all of these things. Y project 5 years ago was great, and I have this reel because all of these shots turned out great because I needed the proper crew, I needed the proper equipment, I needed all these things to come together to create something great. Now I don't have those things. Where, in fact, in a business like this, in a job like this, where you have these objective truths as to how well you are exposing, I think that's something that we can track and that we can use to help gauge if we are still on the right path and help keep me motivated. And it certainly has been that for me. And another thing I'll say is that no amount of time that you spend either analyzing somebody else's images or your own images or doing the light meter testing with whatever new camera you might be looking at, you never waste that time, right? That is always time that is well invested into being calmer on set. And that is one of the major things that as you get more and more experience on set, you'll find that number one, people look for in a cinematographer because you're the leader of a team, but also that you can actually get better results because you are able to focus on things that actually matter, things that move the needle as you start to get away from just, do I have the technical ability to get the exposure that I'm after? Once you have that technical ability, which you should have, if you do the work that nobody else can do for you, right? I can tell you these techniques. Your film school professors, they can tell you these techniques. Roger Deakins can tell you these techniques, but no one can do the work for you, right? You have to sit there, you have to analyze this stuff. But once you do, that opens the door to, again, as I have said numerous times throughout this course, you should never be thinking about this stuff while you're actually on set on the day. There's too many other things that are too influential in the final outcome of a project to be thinking about, well, what's my distribution going to be like inside of this scene? What's my, how am I going to set my box to make sure that I'm doing the least amount of work possible to get the maximum results possible? Because anytime you can leverage that, anytime you can get that balance correct, you're going to be doing a better job than if you hadn't. And immediately that's a huge win on the board that can just help the momentum pick up. And if you've ever been involved in a project that you thought was successful, or that you had an enjoyable time on, or that you wanted to repeat the results of, you'll find that it's often on film sets, it's those early wins, it's that momentum that builds from the top and trickles through the whole crew that can be infectious and set the tone for an entire project. So I would say it's not going to be fun, it's not going to be easy, but it's not an unenjoyable process getting better, especially when you start to see those results early on. But as they start to slow down, just know that I haven't found another way to be able to keep myself honest over time, other than doing the minimum input, which is just simply analyzing my own images in the squeeze and drop, or looking to other people's images in false color just before a project, or for references, or for whatever it might be. I haven't developed another technique in all my time doing this that outperforms the techniques that I've laid out in this course. This is essentially how I think about exposure with no stone left unturned. There is nothing that I know that you don't know now. And hopefully it has guided me well in my career, and it will do the same for you going forward. Well, I got done with that whole big conclusion. I thought, okay, that's it. There's nothing that I had left off of the table that had been beneficial to me in my career. I'm very happy and proud of the results of this course and the way that it's come out and the content, and I think it's going to be helpful to a lot of people. But then I thought, actually, there was something that I used to do quite often that I no longer do, that I sort of outgrew, but for a period of time was instrumental to my ability to focus on what actually mattered in the image and what actually created the depth that we are going for, right? This light to dark pattern across the image to turn a two-dimensional medium into this three-dimensional world that surrounds the viewer, and we're directing them right where to look. And that's that I used to analyze images both on set and in pre-production. I used to do it without any saturation. So I used to do a completely black and white image. And it relates to what I said earlier in the course about how I'm always trying to remove as many variables as I can to work on specific areas of weakness. And saturation, color, has absolutely no bearing on exposure, no bearing on creating depth. The depth is created through the ratios and through the setting of the box. So for a long time, I want to say 3 or 4 years, I used to have a preset on my onset monitor, and I used to have it in my studio as well when I was doing color grading. The very first thing that I would do is I would completely desaturate the image, work off of just black and white, set all of my levels and all of my ratios because there's less to distract me. Much how I talk about how the false colors that I have used the most have the least amount of variables inside of them because I only want to track a certain number of things. Well, switching to black and white, for a period of time, it just got, as you make progress and as you start tracking those false color levels and that what you see is what you get protocol closer and closer and closer, there will be a time where, again, you just get stuck, where you can't overcome this hurdle. And for me, it was about stripping back all of the layers, stripping back everything and only focusing on, okay, my problem seems to be that I'm not able to get these levels in relation to one another consistently on set, no matter what the location is, no matter what the equipment is that I'm using, something seems to be off in the exposure settings. So I'm going to eliminate everything else and just focus on that first. And it worked. It worked. Now, I don't do it anymore because I think I've gotten comfortable enough to be able to do it with my own eyes without needing to go into black and white. But I thought it might be interesting if you're partway into this journey and you've been doing this for a while now and you just hit a bump in the road where you might not be seeing that same amount of progress every month or every job. It's just something to think in the back of your mind because much like, that is really the motto on set for me at any time is to keep it simple. Keep it as simple as you possibly can by removing as many variables as you can. And whether that's at first only looking to that key to background ratio, to then adding in the key to fill to key to backlight ratio and worrying about all those things secondary, to working with less lights, like the less amount of instruments that you can work with, the more you're going to have time to play with those things. And I've found that I value that manipulation time more than I do the control of more lamps. Anytime I seem to put in more variables, the outcome is, no matter the size of the crew, no matter the size of the production, no matter the size of the amount of prep that I have beforehand, the results always seem to be less than ideal or less than I imagined. And that's something that I'm trying to overcome myself. That's one of the areas that I'm working on, is to try and be able to take large sets and large crews and large setups and divide them into areas that have fewer and fewer variables so that I can focus then in on those. But this is a constant and ongoing thing. So I would say if you're just starting out, remember to try and keep things as basic as you can, because that is mastering those basics. If you can master the key to background ratio, and that is 80% of the image, like 80% of the exposure equation in terms of creating images with depth and that are interesting and that feel like the images that you want to reproduce, that is such a huge advantage to be able to do that consistently and not have to think about it. Be able to allocate those resources elsewhere. It really is, it's hard to describe until you've been on a set or you've been on a location scout where you're just instantly doing those things in the background. You're instantly making those calculations and then informing the team around you to be able to reproduce those results. It really is, it's a cheat code. It's almost like a superpower that once you unlock it, you never unsee these things, which is again why none of this is wasted effort. It's like once you do the volume of work necessary to get to that point where you never have to think about this stuff again, that is when the investment starts to pay for itself. And that's when you start to really see the rewards by then being able to allocate your energy elsewhere. So if you do hit a bump, just think about maybe switching things over to black and white as you initially make lighting decisions, or even in the grade as you're adjusting contrast levels or analyzing different shapes. If you cut out the noise, it can help to bring that signal to the foreground. All right, congratulations. We've made it to the end of the course. Good luck in the All right, congratulations. We've made it to the end of the course. Good luck in the journey of exposure. It's an ongoing battle. It's an ongoing experience that you will, hopefully, if you're lucky, have a long, long career of trying to actually master exposure. And you'll be using these techniques and you'll be using this information, the light meter testing, all of that flow chart. If you're like me, you'll be using it on every single job, on every single setup, and constantly refining it and making it better. And it's the start of an exciting journey. And if you're just now getting into some of these tools, I envy the position that you're in for just how quickly you're going to see results that are far beyond what you were doing before you invested this energy in learning these techniques. So good luck in the future, and remember that it's all about the ratios.